Brandon Woodruff facing live hitters for the first time since 2023. A couple more injury updates from camp. Sal Frelick says that he's strong now, adding over 25 pounds of muscle. And Mark Attanasio, unfortunately, in the headlines for some comments he made. Andrew Wagner from Forbes Sports going to join us to talk about that. This is the Brewer Fanatic podcast, spring training edition. Jack Stern joined by Spencer Michaelis as my co-host. Spencer, how you doing tonight?
Doing well. It's a busy day for both of us, but we've got this, and then we're heading off to a practice of our own. So it'll be a busy night, but overall things are good. Baseball's pretty much in full swing now on every level for me, and that makes me happy. So I'm doing well.
Well, yeah, we're gonna have spring training games already starting up pretty soon here over the weekend. So the Brewers will officially be back in action. There were already some games on Thursday starting. I noticed like some highlights of various happenings, mainly the ABS, which is now in place for some of these spring training games. So should be some interesting stuff to watch in the coming weeks here. But we have a little bit of stuff to go through here tonight. So we'll do that really quick, and then we'll be on our merry way. We'll start with Brandon Woodruff facing live hitters for the first time since 2023. Adam McCalvey reporting that Woodruff threw a 25-pitch live session with his full arsenal, Jake Bauers and William Contreras stepping in against him. And it sounds like everything went pretty well, not only just from the standpoint of being able to get through it healthy, feeling good the next couple days afterward, but also the part that was interesting to me is that he reportedly touched 92 miles an hour in this session, which is kind of a big deal. We have a question about exactly that. Andrew asking us on Twitter, what does 92 miles an hour in the first full week of spring training mean for a guy coming off a major injury who typically throws 95, 96 when healthy in a season? So we've, I think, been the lower tier of expectations. We've set a lower tier of expectations for Brandon Woodruff than some other people. This is a little better than I was expecting to see, though, in his first velo reading session since coming off this procedure. I was expecting to see something more in the range of, okay, he's throwing like 88.
Yep.
But 92 is already quite a bit closer to where he was before that injury. Now, Andrew said he's usually 95, 96. When he was at his peak, he was a little more than that. I think he averaged almost 97 on his fastball in his prime. But still, there are instances of like guys who normally throw that hard already just kind of sitting around 92 when they first come back to camp. Now, the note here is this is touch 92, so that could have just been he got up there for one pitch and maybe he was kind of around that, those upper eights for most of it. So that's something you have to keep in mind as well. But the fact that he could already reach back for that right now at basically stage one of the 2025 version of his rehab with where he's at right now, to me, that's already a more encouraging sign than what I was expecting to see. So that has me feeling okay. There's obviously still a lot of hurdles that need to be cleared. You know, you can't really evaluate stuff wise, like how did the movement look, how the execution look. Like it's just a first live at bat session. And that's all stuff that matters too. Like I think of Jimmy Nelson coming off his shoulder injury when he came back, and eventually he got most of his velo back after a couple of years, especially then moving to the bullpen with the Dodgers. But he actually came back with like an entirely different set of pitch shapes.
Yep.
Like he went from like a running four and then a two-seamer to a cutty four-seamer and then the two-seamer that didn't really run as much. It was more of like a traditional fastball. Like that's the other question for Brandon Woodruff. But it was interesting to see, like, from the video that there don't appear to be any changes to his arm action or anything like that, because that was something that there were some whispers about when he would be tossing on the field throughout last season. He had like a shortened arm action compared to what we were used to seeing. So to see him back to the usual throwing motion and then to see that velo, definitely not a bad sign. I'll admit that this is, even if he just touched it and was, you know, otherwise sitting a little lower than that, I think the fact that he got there, this is already a little better than I was expecting.
Yep. 100% agree. That's basically word for word what I was going to say. I was expecting upper 80s, kind of maxing out upper 80s, not even just sitting there, but maxing in that area. So very nice to see 92. For just a little bit of a reference, I saw Dodgers reporters had said Shohei Ohtani was reportedly 92 to 94 in his first outing against hitters, keeping in mind he was already throwing pens during the playoffs last year, and he has Tommy John, which is a different injury, obviously, an elbow injury, but he's on a much different timeline. And even still, he comes into camp, a guy who used to sit even probably a tick or two higher than Woodruff, or at least very similar, and touch higher than Woodruff ever would, because we saw some hundreds and 101s from Ohtani when he was the last healthy. And that's where he was sitting. So, like you mentioned, it's notable that he said touching or touched 92. It could have been just one pitch, but even still, I was not expecting that. And just that combined with Woodruff talking through how he just felt really good, felt comfortable. And then obviously the next day, Murph is talking to reporters and mentions that he felt good, in the follow-up day. All of that is great news combined with seeing some of the velo. So by all accounts, I think this is about as much positive news as I could have possibly hoped for from the first live ABs. It kind of exceeded what I was expecting, like you said. So good news for sure. And I'm still going to refrain from raising my expectations much here, but it's all good news for sure.
I'm also going to add that the Brewers let that information slide for a reason. Like they would not be telling reporters this if they didn't feel pretty good about how that session went. Like, to not only have the comments about he feels good, but to also like throw out a number like, yeah, he hit this number. You don't throw that
Yep.
out there unless you're feeling pretty good about it. If it was the other way around, where they were like, it's okay, but it's not great, or maybe he does look like he's a little behind now, you probably would have heard like, maybe some very broad comments about like how it was good that he got out of it healthy. But if there was an actual issue with the stuff that they were seeing, they would have been pretty hush hush about it, and they kind of would have tried to deflect from that a little bit, or be a little more private about it, I guess. I mean, even the fact that like reporters had access to this live session too, I think already speaks pretty well about how the Brewers are feeling about him. But yeah, a little better than I was expecting to see. So if he gets through a couple more sessions, those are the next steps for him. He's going to throw some more live at bat sessions and then progress from there.
Yeah.
But if he gets a few more into these and the reports are still okay, I guess I'm also going to wait till I'm actually down in camp and get a chance to see him throw, because right now we're just getting all of this through word of mouth. So I guess for me, like, just one session doesn't really change the calculus a whole lot. But I will say, like, I was not expecting to see 92 right now, and that can only be a good thing. Some additional health updates coming from Brewers camp. Christian Yelich spoke to media about his timeline and where he's at. I know we fielded some questions about him last week, and this is before he made these comments. But we had said we figured he was more advanced than Woodruff in terms of his status for opening day. We didn't know if he was going to make the roster, but we figured he was further along. And he did end up telling reporters, in his own words here, quote, "I don't see any reason why I won't be ready for opening day." He says he's on track. He's a full participant in spring training. It looks like he's been doing all of the workouts with no, special treatment or restrictions or anything like that. So seems like we're going to see him in the lineup on opening day. Not really a whole lot to talk about there, but good news nonetheless for the Brewers to have someone who's that important to the success of their lineup set to be ready to go. Next item of business, unless you have something you want to add.
I actually do quickly. I still feel like people are kind of forgetting just how good he was in the first half last year. Like, he was genuinely one of the best hitters in baseball, and that was dealing with the back issue. Now, we don't know exactly how things are going to play out in terms of when he gets into games and he's moving around, how the surgery is going to hold up, everything else. Like, we don't know. But assuming it did go well and he does have good health in the back and he's able to move more freely and stuff, I mean, there's still a very high ceiling here. I'm not going to start predicting MVP Yelich type stuff again, but this was an all-star starter last year while he was dealing with numerous IL stints for the back. He was struggling with even at times being able to move because of it. There's a very high ceiling here still for him to be the best hitter in the Brewers lineup and be one of the better hitters in baseball. So I know people look at the Adames. I just wanted to tie it into the Adames leaving. Like a lot of people have been saying, the Brewers lost their best hitter, which I would nitpick that and say it was Contreras last year anyway. But either way, they lost one of
their best power bat, I think is
yes.
That's where it is for me, and that's kind of what I've been talking about. Like he was not their best hitter, but the reality is you now have to replace 30 plus home runs in that lineup. How are you going to do it? Because you have to do it.
Yes. And the healthy version of Yelich is definitely one of the people who could be playing a pretty big role potentially in helping make up for some of that power. So I just did want to point that out because I just feel like everybody looks at him like it's still a guy we saw for a couple, that 2021 season and those type. Like he was really good last year before he ended up having to sit out.
I don't think it's going to be just him either. I had written earlier this week that, yes, the Brewers this is non-negotiable. They have to find those 30 home runs because with those 30 home runs, I think it was 32 for Willie last year, whatever it was. They were like middle of the pack in baseball in terms of home runs and isolated power. If you take Willie out of that equation and you replace his output from last year on last year's team with the 2025 projections combined for Oliver Dunn, Andrew Monasterio, Caleb Durbin, and then you scale that to the same to have those guys combined for the same amount of plate appearances as Adames had, the Brewers then would have ranked, I think it was like 25th in home runs and 23rd in ISO. So it is a real problem. They cannot say that they're going to be okay without those home runs. That's not true. They are going to be a bad lineup if they don't get those 30 home runs back. If they don't replace them, and it's now going to have to be internally because they didn't do anything to fix that. So now you're in a spot where, yes, Christian Yelich is absolutely a big part of that. But I think it's going to have to be you're hoping that you get a bunch of guys in that lineup who each hit like 4 or 5 more home runs than they did a year ago. So it's going to be Yelich is going to be part of that mix because he's going to play more games. He was on pace for about 20 if he had played in a full season because I think he had 11 at the time he got hurt. And he played in like 70 games. So he was, if I'm doing my math right and I have the numbers right off the top of my head, I think he played like 70 games, hit 11 homers. So he would have been around 20. You can check me on that. William Contreras, I think he had 23 last year. So if you get, 5 more from him or something, or he should be hitting 30 plus home runs a year. I think he's a big one too. Garrett Mitchell's one to look at too, because he is right up there with Contreras for the highest swing speed on the roster. In fact, I think he does have the highest average swing speed on the roster. And we've talked about the work he's been doing at Driveline to try to work behind the ball a little more, to get it in the air, to also get to that high pitch better. He's going to be a big guy to watch. Even like Joey Ortiz. Can Joey Ortiz hit for a little more pop? Because hopefully he doesn't have a neck injury that he's trying to play through, and then it seems to have a ripple effect on his bat speed and his ability to get around. What does a healthy Rhys Hoskins do for you? Again, I'm not really holding my breath that he's going to bounce back, especially after I've looked into it more. But, if he gets some of that lower body mobility back and he can rotate a little better, he probably crosses that 30 homer mark again, because he got to 26, I think, last year, even in the shape he was in. So it's kind of just going to have to be this combination of a lot of guys who like hit for a little more power than they did last year. And if you add that up across the lineup, that's where you're getting your 30 home runs from.
Yeah.
And maybe it works. I would have liked to see them find another way to just more reliably make this happen, but this is kind of where they're at now. They have to get those 30 home runs. That's not, like I said, that's non-negotiable. If you want to be a good lineup, you got to get those 30 home runs back, because if they don't, they're going to be a bad offense. I feel pretty confident about saying that, because you got to hit for power.
I agree.
If you're going to score runs. Like that's how baseball works. You can't grind your way an entire season into good offense. You got to be able to drive the ball at some point. So I'm curious now, like, are they going to get kind of that right mix? There's a couple different combinations, a couple different permutations that would work. So it's not, you need exactly X from each guy. But I think they're counting on, enough guys are going to take that next step, not to the point that they transform, but like they get better enough where they feel good about their ability to replace those home runs, to backfill those home runs. And Christian Yelich is absolutely a part of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another outfielder you didn't mention who has just been shoving Italian food down his throat all offseason that we got to get to here in a second.
Yes, that's who we'll talk about next. That's a really good seg there, man. I could have guessed that you've been in radio for years, coming up with a seg like that. Sal Frelick is according to Adam McCalvey, the leading contender for the best shape of his life award in spring training. Sal never actually claimed to be in the best shape of his life, but he has claimed to have added 25 pounds of muscle over the off season. So he said he changed his diet up a little bit. He was eating 4 meals a day, ate a lot of home cooking, a lot of protein. He actually talked about how he's got to stick to that as well, because he said he actually shed like 3 pounds from the time he left for camp to the time he got there. But he finished last season at 167 pounds. And he told Adam that he's added those 25 pounds of muscle, and now he's trying to stay at 190 this year. So I guess the first question is, like, no offense to Sal, but do we fully believe it was like 25 pounds of muscle, or do we think he's exaggerating a little bit? Because 25 pounds of muscle, like, the healthy benchmark is what, adding a pound or two a week?
Yes.
And 25 pounds in like a 5-month off season, that's a lot.
That it's almost impossible naturally. So honestly, the fact that he lost 3 pounds on the trip points to it being there's water weight involved here. There's all these types of things. Like, you don't lose muscle weight that quickly in a short turnaround like that. But I do not believe that he put on 25 pounds of muscle, but I believe that it's 25 pounds of legitimately good mass. That doesn't have to be pure muscle. It can be productive, good mass that was put on. That's not going to hamper him in terms of movement or speed or anything else. But I know his main goal with this was mostly he just felt like he was wearing down as the season progressed, and he wanted to be in a better spot where he doesn't feel that. But I think in terms of just, tying it into the power part too, I'm not expecting much power. I'm not saying we're going to see a huge power breakout, but I have maintained I've always thought he was a guy who could be a double-digit home run guy. I saw it in the minors. I saw the swings. I saw harder hit balls. Add a little bit more muscle to the frame. Add in the fact that maybe his second to last at bat of the season was his hardest hit ball and his furthest hit ball of his career. I'm sure there was a little bit of okay, I'm going into the offseason. Now I know I'm capable of doing stuff like that. Try and put in a little bit more work into, getting into that in games when I get a pitch that I can actually turn on and hit. And so I think, that combo of all of that means it wouldn't totally shock me if this was the year that we saw closer to double-digit homers, or even, 10-ish. But I'm not expecting it to be this huge power breakout by any means. I just think when you combine everything we've seen from him since that last game in October, there's reason to think that there might be a little bit more in-game power showing up this year.
Yeah, I'm just curious if this means, is he going to swing the bat harder? That's what I've been talking about all winter.
Yeah.
Like, I think he can do it. And that home run, while that home run is obviously going to be like the upper tier of how hard he can swing the bat, he's not going to replicate that, but it proves that he can swing harder than he has. I've told people, like, I know he's, what is he, like 5'7"? He's not a tall guy.
Yeah.
Well, 5'7", I might be selling him short a little bit. But the bottom line is he's not a tall guy, but he's actually, this guy was a former hockey player. He's built pretty good. And this is even before the supposed 25 pounds of muscle he's put on. Like, seeing him in the clubhouse last year, he's actually built pretty well. Like, you can see there should be more strength there than like this little slap hitting, bottom of the order guy who can't hit the ball over 75 miles an hour or whatever. So I think it's in there. he's never going to be a power hitter, but I wonder if this is kind of the next step now where he hopefully feels a little bit more comfortable with swinging a little harder, just being able to put a little bit more on the ball, because that is what he's missing. I think if he gets that, he's going to be a solid hitter. We've always talked about him having a high floor, and I think even the fact that, with having some of the worst quality of contact metrics in baseball, he's still been like a 90 OPS plus kind of guy.
Yeah.
I think he was a little below that this year, but for his career, like he's around 90, I think. I think that's already kind of a sign of, again, like this is probably closer to what you would think was not the worst case scenario for Frelick, but like this was the concern, like that he wasn't going to hit the
Yeah.
ball hard enough. And I'm kind of hoping it can only go up from here. And this is kind of the first step toward that. So we'll see what happens on that front. Another quick injury update also from Adam. JB Bukauskas threw live BP on Wednesday, I believe, and came away with an arm injury. So he underwent an MRI. We're going to get more information about that. We had talked about this a few weeks ago, the fact that he was DFA'd and cleared waivers and stayed with the Brewers, potentially not being a great sign for where his health is at, or at least how other teams perceive his health. And now he's already dealing with another injury, a week or two into camp. So not a great start for JB. Unfortunate, because this is still a guy who we're both pretty high on in terms of how the stuff would play out of a big league bullpen if he were healthy. But it is looking increasingly like we're just never going to really get a chance to see that, because he's already behind the 8 ball, not on the 40-man. Just not a great situation, and just generally not great for the Brewers' depth either to be losing a guy like that this early already. But we'll get more information about that as spring training progresses. Next update, and I think this is really the big one to talk about this week as far as on-field news goes, the infield alignment. And this is one we're going to sort through a little bit, because there were actually competing messages here about what's actually going to be happening in the infield. So Mark Attanasio, who we're going to talk about plenty later in this show, said earlier this week that Tyler Black was going to be in the mix at third base. They wanted to get him time at third base, and Joey Ortiz could slide to shortstop. Pat Murphy then, according to Dominic Cotroneo, telling the media like a day later that Tyler Black is going to be playing mostly first base, which is where he was last year, so that would mean no change. That's what I'm more inclined to believe based on how we've seen the Brewers use him, some evaluations of his defense. I think he is still primarily the first baseman. And then Matt Arnold said at the start of camp that the whole infield alignment was still to be determined. So Dom also adding that on Thursday, when the Brewers are doing their infield work, it was Bryce Terang working out at shortstop with Ortiz still at third and Caleb Durbin at second base. So I'm still very much in the boat of, I think there is a decent chance Bryce Terang ends up at shortstop. I don't think that's what anyone prefers. I think the Brewers prefer to have Joey Ortiz at short, but I still think the wild card in this whole thing is just who ends up being that guy who is effectively replacing Willy Adames, not in terms of position, but just on the infield.
Yeah.
And if it is Caleb Durbin getting a lot of playing time, it's, do they think their best overall alignment is Caleb Durbin at third, Ortiz at short, Terang at second? Or is it Ortiz at third, Terang at short, Durbin at second? Really, Durbin is the key factor here, because if they don't like Caleb Durbin's defense at third base, do they do their own math and say, yes, Bryce Terang is going to be not a platinum glover at shortstop, but having his glove at short is actually still better for us than trying to have Caleb Durbin play third base. And I would imagine that mostly comes down to they think Durbin could be a really good defensive second baseman more than anything. So you just have a lot of moving parts going around right now, and I think they're currently in the process, it seems, of figuring out how everybody looks at each spot. It sounds like everyone's going to get reps all over, and we'll kind of have to see how this whole thing unfolds. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, number one, like we've talked about before, how you want this to line up and how you think it's going to end up?
Yeah, I think in terms of how I'm hoping it ends up lining up, it is Terang at second, Ortiz at short, and then Dunn and Durbin at third. But I think you're exactly right that the kind of the linchpin in all of it is if Durbin can handle third base. I've seen him. I've watched some video of it. I think he's capable of it. I really do. But I have mentioned before, like, I genuinely wonder if height factors into the equation here at third base. If you think about like line drives towards third base, balls that you have to dive for down the line, like there's just a little bit less room for a guy who's that short. And say you don't get to a ball like that at second base, it's probably a single. Ball gets over your head down the line at third base on a ball that most third basemen probably could have reached up or not had to jump nearly as high for. And it's probably a double, maybe even a triple, depending on how it bounces, how everything happens. I almost wonder if that factors in a little bit. I don't think that's going to be the driving factor, but I've just been wondering that all offseason. Like, do they actually care about the height over there? Does it not factor? And that's just more of a random, like, baseball nerdy thing that I'm trying to think of. Like, does it matter? I have no idea. I will say this. Baseball America put out an article comparing 3 nameless players that ended up including Caleb Durbin, as they showed at the end of the article. And in that, we got more StatCast data from the minor leagues that we don't normally have access to, including sprint speed and throwing stuff. In terms of his arm, now it would not be a good arm for third base. Do not get me wrong there. But it would be basically in line with his average, and his max are basically in line with Jose Ramirez, Alex Bregman, Cabrian Hayes. It's like a low 80s average in terms of miles per hour.
That's his max?
No, that's his average. His max is more in like the 84, which is still in the same range as those guys last year. I was looking at it in comparison.
So when you talk about average, is that his overall average or his average throws from third base?
Average from, I believe, that's a good question, actually. I think it was his average
because
overall.
you're going to have guys when they play second base, their average throw is going to be slower because you're not throwing across the
I
line.
actually do. I do think it was overall.
That's the caveat to think about here.
Yes. Yes.
So
and I actually did think about that until you just asked me, and then I blew it. But no, it is. I believe it is overall. But either way, I think it shows that at the very least that concern where it's like, well, can he even play it with the arm he has? We've seen it. You can do it with that type of arm. And some of those guys have been good defenders at third base. It's not at all like a debilitating thing for somebody at third base to have his type of arm. He could handle it with that. Obviously, everything else, we don't have access to, like how quickly he's transferring it and everything else. But when I watch it on video, that was the thing I always thought could make up for the arm, was that, okay, he gets it out super quick. He's got a good release. So I think he could do it. At the same time, I do think that there's a pretty decent chance he would be like a borderline plus, if not better, defender at second base. So to that extent, I would understand if they did decide to go, if Durbin is going to be like an everyday guy. I think that's really what it's going to come down to as well. If he's going to be an everyday guy, do they think potential plus at second base, potentially above average to maybe even still plus it comparatively to other shortstops with Terang? And then we've already seen Ortiz be basically a plus defender at third. Is that better than the potential for like elite at second with Terang, probably close to plus at short, and then good at third base? I think, like you said, it's all going to be kind of an equation in the Brewers' head. Like, what gives us the overall best defensive alignment? And I'll always weigh shortstop a little more heavily than any other spot on the infield. I think it should be that way, and I think most metrics do factor that in. So for me, I still wind up coming back to Ortiz being the guy I want there for that reason. But I do think it'd be hard to go wrong if those are your 3 starting infielders. I do think the defense overall will be in a pretty good spot, whichever way they end up going.
Question we got on the infield alignment from the Ginger. That's a heck of a username.
I loved it.
Thinking if Oliver Dunn isn't the answer at third base, what are some players that you could potentially see being available to swing a Willy Adames style trade? Who would you target and who would you give up? One of the examples he cites is Ronnie Mauricio of the Mets. He's not sure kind of what his trade value is or what it would cost to get him, but kind of a name he's throwing out there. I know this is always usually a little bit more of your territory than mine, so I kind of saw you nodding along there. Do you have any names in mind, or do you agree with the name he
I
threw out?
I both actually. Yes, Mauricio's a good shout for me. He's somebody that kind of has gone under the radar. He missed, I believe, all of last year with an injury. But this is a guy who's a top prospect who's going to be somewhat blocked in New York. He's been a shortstop prospect, but I believe he's someone who could play at any of the three infield spots. A guy who, in his brief major league debut in 2017, had hit a ball 117 miles per hour. There's legitimate pop there. There is athleticism, depending on how he comes back from his injuries and everything else. He always graded out. I can't speak to this personally. I haven't seen him play much defense, but he always graded out pretty decently as a shortstop from scouts throughout his time. And it does feel like one of those things where he's been hurt a lot. They have a relatively set left side of the infield in New York with Vientos, who could probably play first, but now you have Alonso back and everything else. And then Lindor. I think the question is, could Mauricio be their second baseman and McNeil plays outfield? They do a lot of other things there. So he might not end up being super blocked, but I really do like that one. I think that would be like the biggest swing you could possibly take for a guy who could make like a Willy Adames type of impact for the Brewers. I think a lot of people like to point to Brett Beatty when we talk about these types of things. I'm out on Beatty. I just really would not. I would rather roll with like Oliver
Agreed.
Dunn than
Yeah.
Brett Beatty.
No, I'm not a Brett Beatty guy.
Yeah. And then the other one I think of, and I didn't look much into the Rangers infield situation, but I know they've had quite a bit of depth over the last few years, is Josh Young. He fits that top prospect bill, who he had a really solid season 2 years ago. He had a bit of a step back last year. It was like a barely 700 OPS. He also missed quite a bit of time himself with some injuries, but a guy who hits for power. There is some strikeout in there, but plays a solid third base. It's kind of a little bit like the Willy Adames profile, probably not as athletic as Willy was, and obviously at third instead of short, but it gives me that kind of vibe where it's like, yeah, he showed some good things already. He had a little bit of a step back. He had some injuries. Things aren't going perfectly there. They might be ready to move on from him at some point coming up. He's the other one I found, but of the two, like I would like Mauricio better than that, but either one of them would be pretty interesting in that type of deal, I think. And just in terms of how much you'd have to give up, I think it would end up being similar to the Adames deal, where both of these are competitive teams. You're probably giving up some sort of like major league talent in return, somebody who they think could help them. And that probably does end up coming from the pitching side of things, if I had to guess. So I could see kind of a similar deal to the Adames one for somebody like that if they end up going that route. And I won't belabor this point too much, but I do think this is something the Brewers will consider. If we remember what happened in the Adames year, they ended up getting rid of Arcia early in that season, maybe spring training, or was it just barely after the season started they had made that trade?
I think he only made it like a week.
Okay.
He played in like 3 games and that was it.
Right. And then Urias goes to short, and that was a major struggle defensively. So they went out and made this trade. And I think that's kind of the thing. Like, everyone sometimes views opening day as like that's your roster, and you can still do things once the season starts. You can still make relatively major moves, especially for somebody that you might be quote unquote buying low on, which I think is what you'd be trying to do with these guys, and hopefully regaining some of that prospect status, getting them healthy, all those things. But those are the two names, Mauricio and Young, I think are the two that I would look at the most and be like, that could be a really interesting fit, probably for both sides.
Unfortunately, one of the main stories that we have so far from Brewers camp involves the owner, and that's always a good sign when the owner is one of the stories. But Mark Attanasio making his annual comments at the onset of spring training to the media, nothing out of the ordinary there. And there were, as you would expect, a lot of payroll discussions, a lot of discussions about what was a very slow offseason. Spencer, I know we talked on the podcast throughout the winter about how we expected this to be a very slow offseason, but I think we could probably agree it's been even a little bit slower than that. I think we were both in the boat of they're probably at least going to add somebody for the infield, and they didn't do that. They still could, but they haven't yet. And now the clock is really starting to tick, and the options are dwindling in free agency and on the trade market. So that was one of the discussion topics from that session. And really, there was one partial quote from Mark Attanasio in this session that created a little bit of a local media firestorm on Brewers Twitter and in the Brewers media sphere. So Bob Nightingale wrote a story based off Attanasio holding court with the media. And within that story, he put the quote in this form, Attanasio saying, "Is it my job to win a World Series, or is my job to provide a summer of entertainment and passion and a way for families to come together?" So as you could imagine, this was not received well, because if you just read that one quote, it absolutely sounds like the owner of a Major League Baseball team is downplaying if it's his goal to win a World Series. And it was also surprising for me to see that, because it does go against what the pretty consistent messaging has been from everybody within the Brewers front office, which is our goal is to win a World Series, but we're going to do it by consistently being in the playoff mix every year, as opposed to pushing all of our chips in and running the risk of not getting the big prize after putting our chips in, and then we have to go through a big rebuild, and it just puts us in a spot that nobody wants to be in. So to have this quote in and of itself, just this one sentence, sounding like he's acting like it's not his job to win the World Series, it was weird to see. And, we were both texting about it as soon as this dropped, and our initial thoughts were right away, this really feels like something where the full quote was not included, or there was just a snippet of it taken out. And this is not meant to discredit Bob Nightingale, but kind of just a combination of just seeing that one quote, just seeing that one screenshot. I think that's a big part of this too. If you actually read the full story, there are portions of it where it does kind of sound to me like he's really trying to fit a certain narrative, but at the same time, he does actually include a lot of nuances in there, including like right around that quote. There actually is another paragraph where he talks about Attanasio would love to win a World Series. So probably not necessarily the way he even intended to frame it himself as the writer slash reporter. But basically a whole lot of hoopla coming out of this quote, even to the point where we had Mark's son, Mike, telling everybody on social media that his father was misquoted and da 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 and this, that, and the other. So basically, kind of a big circus coming out of all of this. And eventually we find out, kind of like we would have expected, this is not the actual full context of the quote. There was a lot more he said. And we're going to bring in somebody who had boots on the ground as this was all going down. We're going to bring in my press box neighbor at American Family Field, Andrew Wagner. You can find his work at Forbes Sports and a variety of other media outlets in the sports sphere. He's boots on the ground, like I said, in Arizona right now, covering the Brewers in spring training. Wags, first of all, thanks for coming on. And then can you just kind of run us through really quickly what the full context of, number one, this quote, the question that was asked, what the response was like, but also number two, just the full context of kind of what this media session was like with Mark Attanasio?
Jack, I mean, you've been to it before. You've been to Mark Attanasio sessions before. It's a pretty informal gathering. We're seated around a table. This used to be, up till a couple of years ago, it was just Mark and the everyday beat writers. And the thing kind of grew a little bit to, the first day of full squad workout, and you have a lot of TV guys down here, and it grew to a big local scrum. This year, we figured it was going to be pretty low key because it's just me, Rosiak, and McKelvey. Lance Allen was there from CBS 58. So we walked in that day, and then you see Rosenthal walk in, you see Nightingale walk in. Jared Diamond was there. Somebody else was there. I can't remember who it was now. But why are four national people coming to this, little gaggle? We're going to sit there and we're going to ask about payroll. We're going to ask about the Adames trade. Ask the usual questions we ask. And as soon as we got in there, it was just the national guys, kind of peppering them with spending and the Dodgers and disparity and competitive balance. And, I think between me, Todd, and Adam, we probably each asked one question. And the majority of the questions during this 45-minute session were asked by the national guys. And like you said, this is not a knock against Bob at all. I like Bob Nightingale. He's been great to me over the years. I think he's a great writer. Same thing with Rosenthal. I think he's one of the best in the business. But after hearing them and the questions they're asking, you got the impression they had already had their story written and they were looking for a quote, which, okay, fine. We've all been there before. Like, that's all you need. Plug in a quote, hit send, you're done. Go play golf. The question that was asked that led to Mark's response was a question from Adam. And it was, we were talking about Yelich's back. And he had said, given all that had happened since signing that contract, would you ever sign another player to a deal like that again? And Mark went into, for him, a thoughtful response to it. What goes into making a decision to sign a guy that long in such a small market? Now, where he screwed up, and Mark has done this before, is when he asked that rhetorical question, he should have just said, my job is both. Instead of saying that one word, he tried to explain it further and ended up going off on tangents and whatever. Fine. I get the optics. This is on him as much as anyone else because he had the power to stop it. What happened then, and I didn't see this till the next morning, obviously, was the quote in Nightingale's story, which, okay, he was not misquoted. And Bob went on a couple of local shows today to say that, and I agree with him. He wasn't misquoted. But that was just one part of a longer answer to a completely unrelated question. And that's where the issue comes in. And whether it's ethics, whether it's whatever, I don't know what you want to call it. But that quote was used completely out of context from the question that was asked.
Spencer, you were the one who was kind of involved in the misquoted allegations because, Wags, I know you brought that word up. Like I had said, Mark's son, Mike, actually stepping in and saying that he was in the room as this was all going down, that his dad was misquoted. Spencer, you were the one he actually quote tweeted. First of all, before I get any further, what was your response to that in that moment? Because you're not, this is going to sound like I'm talking down to you, but you're not a prestigious media member like the rest of us. You're just kind of hanging out doing your thing. But no, so that was obviously something that was all part of this too, that he was stepping in to say this publicly. What was kind of your reaction when that went down?
Yeah, it was a surprising notification to get, to say the least. I was sitting at work. I had obviously not been paying enough attention at work because I was tweeting during it, but getting that notification while I was sitting there, pretty big surprise. I think, like you kind of talked about there, he called it being misquoted. I would say it was a little bit more misleading than misquoted. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, the words came out of his mouth and he printed them. It's not like there was really any, you can't really go back on that. There's recordings of that. I know some people played that on the radio this week or in the last couple of days. But out of context, it sounds a lot different than it does when you have the whole story. So the original reaction to that quote was just kind of like you said, we were texting back and forth and we were kind of like, it feels weird that, first of all, nobody else really printed this. Like there were a lot of stories that came out from that press conference, and this was really the only story that had really picked that quote to run with. So that felt a little off to me when it was in the moment. But at the same time, like even knowing that it might be a little out of context, you knew it was going to be a quote that was going to get a lot of attention and that it didn't sound great. So just overall, it was, I guess, not a super surprising. The way everything played out wasn't super surprising just based on what we were talking about right away. But I think in a way, I can't think of a better phrase than digging your own grave, but in some ways, like the way he worded things is what got him in trouble. So I think most people probably knew it wasn't exactly what he meant, but it did. He set himself up for some kind of consternation from the fan base.
Yeah, and Wags, I know you brought that up first when you were talking about this here with us just a couple seconds ago. I feel like this is just kind of a repeating cycle that we get every single year. It happens a lot when Mark goes like publicly on record in front of the cameras, because he does talk to us behind the cameras sometimes about some stuff in some closed door sessions. And at least, in those kinds of settings, stuff like this is a little less likely to happen just because he doesn't have the pressure of having the cameras running on him and all this stuff. It's all still on the record stuff that can be printed, but it is definitely a much different setting. But he does kind of open himself up to a lot of these things.
Oh, absolutely.
Not because he's, not trying his hardest to give good messaging, but it just seems like when he's kind of in these situations, like, you can tell there are a lot of moments where he's trying to say something and it doesn't come out the way he wants it to. And it comes out in a way where, unfortunately, this is going to happen. It's kind of this combination of, yes, there are people who overreact to it. Yes, there are going to be times like this where you have a quote that is not printed in the same context in which that quote was uttered. But as that's coming out of Mark's mouth, and maybe he realizes it as it's going down too. Like, public speaking is not easy. I get it. But when you're a public figure like this, everything you say is going to be scrutinized in this way. So when you say something like that, like, you have to expect that there's going to be blowback. There's going to be people who interpret it in the worst way possible. But it seems like this is just kind of an annual occurrence. There's almost always something that goes on where he does something like this, whether it was this instance, whether it was a couple of years ago when the Brewers traded Josh Hader and he was trying to make comments along the lines of, I trust my front office, but it ended up coming out like he was throwing David Stearns under the bus. And that was how it was interpreted. There's just a lot of different situations like that. When Craig Counsell left as well, when he made the comment about Craig losing the community, like, you could tell what he was trying to say, but it did not come out very well. He said something that could very easily, and honestly, like, even if you're still using it ethically, it can very easily still, like, be framed as he's saying something that he didn't intend to mean. So I do think that's something important to keep in mind as well. Like, this is a both sides problem. Yes, this quote was not printed in the proper context. Probably more importantly, yes, there were people who just looked at the quote instead of reading the full story, and they ran with it in a way they shouldn't have. But at the same time, like, this is a part of his job. I think he wants to be transparent. Like, he does, I think, come off as more willing to talk about things than the vast majority of owners. He is more accessible when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Like, you and I both see it. He is much more accessible and, relative to other owners, more transparent. But this is kind of like the drawback of it. I think when he tries to do that, it does kind of end up blowing up in his face a little bit, like it did here.
And I think that's part of the reason the Brewers have kind of shifted their availabilities with Mark, because it's always been very informal, whether it's on the field or behind the press box or whatever. This setup's a little different, informal. The only recording being done is by the beat writers so they can get the quotes accurate. TV was present for this gathering, but they weren't allowed to record. They were given some one-on-one time out on the patio afterwards, but they try to, I don't want to say cover, they're not covering up for him, and they're not limiting his exposure, but they're trying to guard against exactly what you said. Like, listen, I like Mark Attanasio as a person. I think as a reporter, we're incredibly lucky here to have the access to the owner that we do. I mean, I also cover the Bucks, and good luck getting an owner. I hear over in Pittsburgh, they rarely, if ever, hear from their owner. And there's a lot of teams that will go an entire season without hearing from the owner, and we get him several times a year. You're right. He has a tendency to kind of slip up. He is not the most eloquent man in the world, and doesn't have to be. He's a hedge fund manager. He's a billionaire. These guys aren't supposed to be out in front of the cameras. He just happens to be willing to do it, and good on him. Do they need to help him clean up the messaging? Absolutely. Did he put himself in this position? Absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason that you didn't see, one of the accusations I get on Twitter is you local guys are just lazy. Well, no, we're not lazy. We're just not stupid. We know, having talked with him enough, when he's rambling on a tangent and getting off track, like, we get it. We understood what he was talking about in terms of signing a player to a long-term deal in the context of what he said, winning a World Series and keeping fans entertained every summer. Like, we understood it. Again, he should have just said both, but the reason you didn't see me and Todd and Adam writing about it was because, well, first of all, we couldn't understand his damn answer to the question. Like, you go back and read it, and listen, I put the brunt of the answer out there, the question and the answer. He went on for another 2 minutes talking about how, like, CC Sabathia's legacy in Milwaukee and all these other things. So it's like, okay, this is just Mark, rambling on again. It's not a knock on him. It's just, we're used to this. We didn't see it as a big deal. We got the answer that we needed from the answer that he gave. Like, yes, he would sign a player to a long-term deal like that. Has to be the right player at the right time in the franchise. Boom, there's the answer.
I was going to ask you that as like one of my final follow-ups here. So like, we know what he wasn't trying to say from the quote, but then you were there and, I know you tweeted out a good chunk of it, but you also put a note on the bottom just talking about how he basically started rambling after this about stuff that didn't seem nearly as relevant to the actual question that was asked. So I was going to ask, what was your response about what was he trying to say as he was giving this answer?
It was just simply like, yes, I'd absolutely take that risk again. Because let's face it, signing Christian Yelich, even coming off those 2 seasons, is a risk. And we've seen why the last couple of years. And in a market like Milwaukee, and I have said this countless times until I'm blue in the face, it's not so much the AAV that kills you. If you can get a starter that's willing to come here for, if you could have signed, Christian Yelich as a free agent on a 1 or 2 year deal, great. But players don't want those kind of deals. They want the length of the contracts is what hamstrings franchises like the Brewers. So when you're signing a guy like Yelich, even coming off those seasons, you are gambling big time. Because if the team tanks, and we saw this with Ryan Braun, how much of the payroll did he account for during some rough and tumble years? And he wasn't very productive in those years. That's a big investment for a franchise that cannot guarantee long-term financial success. You can have a good year and know you're going to be okay in the next year following, but you don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. And I think that is the point that Mark was making. If you get another player like that, let's say that Bryce Terang figures out his bat and turns into just an absolute stud, offensive, defensive. Would Mark's maybe, it's the right player at the right time in the franchise's life cycle. And I think it was a valid question to ask, considering all the young talent that you have in place right now. I just rambled on like Mark Attanasio.
No, that's okay. We do plenty of rambling on this show. That's why our run times are so long. So you're fitting right in. I guess the last thing I just want to say here before we let you go is just kind of a reiteration, a version of what I already said on Twitter as this is all going down. But situations like this, and I'm sure you can absolutely echo this, Wags, these are the moments where you really need to take stock of how valuable it is to have local beat guys and how important it is to support local beat guys. And I'm not just talking about the two of us. Like, I'm also talking about Todd and Adam and Kurt and all these people, because the national guys.
Away with Kurt. Let's not get carried away with Kurt.
All right. Friend of the pod, Kurt Hogue. But when you have these national guys who do very valuable work covering MLB at large, you're going to run into problems in the exact situations that you're describing, where we've been around Mark. We've talked to Mark several times in several different settings. We know how he talks. We know kind of the nuances of, okay, here's the point he's trying to make here. Here's where he's rambling on, and this is really not relevant to the question. Or here's what he's trying to say by rambling on, for 5 minutes on something that seems unrelated. Those national guys, when they come in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have nearly as much experience with them as you do. But I think when those guys come in, because they're not spending so much time at a single camp with specific people, repeatedly talking to them, they're not going to know all of that stuff when they show up. So I think that's how you get into a situation where, this quote ends up printed the way it was. You have this kind of reaction to it. I think that's really where it all starts. So appreciate the work that the national guys do for what it is. But at the same time, if you're really looking for in-depth coverage of your team, whether it's Milwaukee, a small market here, or any team, support your local media, your local beat writers, because these are the people who are around every day. They have their fingers on the pulse, and they're going to be able to give you the most accurate, comprehensive coverage where you're probably not going to have these kinds of things happen.
Absolutely. And what? I actually got to thank Bob, because if it wasn't for Bob and Ken and their stories, I would have been public enemy number one during that session because I inadvertently asked Mark if it was time to start thinking about a new stadium. So they helped me dodge a bullet.
That is a bullet dodge. So maybe this is just an all's well that ends well type situation. But thanks, Wags, for coming on and kind of helping us break down the situation. I understand you'll still be in Brewers camp for a few more days at least. Are you down there for another week or two yet?
I'm down here till March 4th, but judging from the forecast, I may just not come back. Like, it's going to be in the 90s for the next couple of weeks. I'm sitting on a rooftop having a refreshment. I'm going to watch the USA Canada game from this rooftop. Like, I don't think I'm ever leaving.
Well, if you want to just stay down there for the entirety of camp for when I get down there on the back end, I'm more than okay with that. But we'll let you go now to your evening activities that you just described. But thank you for joining us and kind of helping to clear the air on this whole situation. I think it's really important to give people the proper context.
Anytime, boys. Go Wisconsin Lutheran.
Have a good night, man. All right, so we won't spend too much more time on this. Thanks to Andrew Wagner for joining us to kind of clarify a little bit. I guess last thing I want to touch on before we move on is just more specifically the actual topic at hand here. I know Andrew touched on it a little bit with like giving out long-term deals and the spending, because that is what this gets back down to. It's the spending debate, which is something that's been going on for years. It's going to continue going on for years. This is just always the way it's almost certainly going to be for the kind of market the Brewers play in. But one thing that I really wish the Brewers did, and this comes back to the PR messaging side of things, you know, if you're Mark or you're anyone speaking on behalf of the organization about spending, I really, really wish that they would, and I think they try to do this already a little bit, but I think they can do it even more and do a better job of it. Emphasize how much you have put into player development resources.
Yes.
Because this comes back to what the two of us have talked about all the time. There is more to an organization's spending than payroll. You know, I do think there's a reason why when you look at like these graphs of a percentage of revenue spent on payroll, that's because your 26-man or your 40-man payroll, I guess, that's only a fraction of the cost that it takes to run a Major League Baseball team. There's all kinds of other things you're paying for as well. Now, granted, I'm just kind of speaking speculatively here from what my common sense is trying to tell me. Of course, most of these guys are going to operate in a way that makes them money, because even if you are a big baseball fan, businessmen are still going to run this like a business. They're going to want to make money out of it. And I think it's true for some owners who both want to win and also want to make money at the same time. Like, I think that's a lot more common than people would assume. But kind of to get back to the point I'm making here, the Brewers have invested quite a bit into player development, and it comes back to, if you're going to spend money, kind of like what we were just talking about with Wags about, yes, Mark will do certain long-term deals if he thinks they're good investments and right for the franchise, which also leads to this whole debate about, I just don't like the blind screams to spend. I would always have the demand be to spend, but spends wisely.
Yep.
But I do think that's what the Brewers do on the player development front. They put so much into these resources. This is several years ago now, but it's still a pretty major project that they embarked on, redoing the entire Arizona complex to make that a huge high-tech player development hub, purchasing the Mudcats a few years ago. Mark bought the Mudcats so that the Brewers have ownership of, you know, critical development level in their minor league system. They're paying for all the tech that they have to use. I haven't gone through like trying to stack up the size of their minor league coaching staffs to other organizations, but if you actually look at those announcements when they come out about those staffs, those are some very big staffs, and some of the titles you see there kind of make you scratch your head and wonder, like, what could this guy possibly be doing? Like, what does this title mean? But that speaks to how many people you have in that pipeline helping with development. You have to pay those guys too to help out with that kind of stuff. So one of the things I really, really, really wish they do an even better job of is emphasizing how many resources, financial and otherwise, they put into player development. You know, at one of these closed door sessions that I was talking about from this last year with the media, I tried asking him like some version of that question, asking Attanasio, like, I think I phrased it more as like, can you just touch on the importance of player development and kind of what you guys do on that front for an organization with the the kind of goals you have and the kind of market you're playing in. And he did give me some good stuff. That was when he talked about just the cohesion that they have across levels, the stuff they emphasize. That's when Matt Arnold dropped that they have a proprietary metric they use for tracking swing decisions. But what I was really hoping to hear him get at, and why I might try to ask this question again this year in a different way, is, even if I'm not looking for a number, like, can you just tell me, like, relative to your resources, like roughly, like how much are you actually putting into player development? Like, are you spending a lot of resources on player development? Because, if they can at least try to emphasize that a little more, I know there are going to be certain people you never please, but I think it would change the perspective of a lot of people. If we could just get someone with the Brewers to say, yes, we invest a lot in player development because we know that's an investment that's a lot safer. It's going to continually pay off over the years, because it's not just about investing in one player. It's about investing in a bunch of different players. The Latin American facility, that's the one I was missing that they also spent a lot of money on. That's a big one too. That's where you have guys like Churio and Jesus Mate coming out of that kind of, facility. And they also spend on having to send scouts to those areas too, as well, and having a scouting department down there. Like, all of this kind of stuff, I think that's the area where it makes the most sense for them to spend, which is why I wish that they would emphasize that a little more than they do.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to touch on the Dominican complex too before you snuck it in at the end. That was going to be my first one. But no, as an organization, they've definitely put a lot into it. I believe it was the Journal Sentinel article, because they did talk about this, like you mentioned. He did talk about this a little bit this week during this session. He did mention a little bit that, we have one of the nicest complexes in Arizona, and we do have the brand new state-of-the-art facility in the Dominican Republic. And I believe he had even said that they have 40 instructors and coaches at that Dominican Academy as well. So, like, that's quite a few people that are going in, and a lot of people who are involved in making that thing tick and making everything work down there. Like you said, overall, it's a pretty big, just minor league staff. It's well staffed. It was an Athletic article last year. Katie Wu wrote it about the Cardinals. It was mainly pointing out how far behind the Cardinals are compared to a lot of teams with their player development. But I do remember at the time, one of the main points being that the Brewers just exponentially more minor league coaches, more instructors, more roving instructors, all the different things than a team like the Cardinals. And her point in the article is basically like, this is where they're falling behind in the Central, and this is where the Brewers are kind of getting the dirty work done to make it work how they've done it, which we've seen play out. Like, the Brewers have, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of other NL Central fan bases probably look at the Brewers how we always used to look at the Cardinals, which was they somehow just keep winning. They keep doing the right things. They keep having random guys come up and help them every year. And I think that's kind of where it's gotten to at this point. And the Brewers are in a lot of ways cutting edge in those types of departments. And that doesn't mean I would go out on a limb and say that the Dodgers are still probably spending even more money than the Brewers on these types of things too, because they have that type of money to throw around. They just do. But I think the Brewers, probably comparatively to other teams and organizations that are in the area of the Brewers in market size and everything else, it feels like they're out kicking a lot of the other teams in their range with this type of stuff. And like you said, it'd be nice for them to point that out. It should be a feather in their cap. It's not something that you should feel like, oh, we don't need to talk about it, everyone's aware of it, or like, oh, it's not that important to people like to hear about payroll. Like, make the point. This is a real thing. This matters. This is what is helping your organization see this much success, as much success as it's seen lately. And yeah, I think we talked about it early last year at one point, like some of this stuff, but I just think it does need to be highlighted. And the best person to highlight it is ownership. Like, they're the people who are actually going out and doing it. So I agree with you completely. I think just making it a point to show that, like, not everything we're doing shows up on the opening day payroll. That's just not how it works. And we don't need to hear about stadium operating expenses and those types of things. Nobody's going to care about that. But what other things are you doing to improve the team and the organization? Fans like to hear about that stuff. Like, those are things that they're not going to poo-poo and just say, okay, whatever, like, it's not on our team. No, this is money that actually matters to people. This is money that people would see value in. So I think highlighting it is something they should absolutely be doing more of.
Whenever we talk about payroll and ownership, like this is what it always comes back to for me. This is what you're always going to hear me say. Number one, there are absolutely valid instances in which I think it makes sense to complain about having not spent money.
Mm-hmm.
But I cannot stand like the screeches from the rooftops of just spend with no more specifics. I try not to tell people how to be a fan or anything, but like if you're gonna try to act like you're taking a moral high ground by screaming at someone to spend more money, like on anything without being more specific, I'm sorry, that's dumb. It's dumb to just say spend and give no more specifics. Okay, well, let's look at who can we spend on? Is that a worthwhile expense? Yes, even if we have the money, who cares? Is that a good, smart way of operating? Let's talk about that a little bit. And it's different for every situation. Like there have been instances in the past where I wanted the Brewers to spend a little more than they did because there were guys out there that really made a lot of sense who they didn't spend on. Those instances have become increasingly few and far between because these last few markets have not been great for him in free agency. I think they operate the right way. And I do think that by and large, the way they operate is more so a product of wanting to be smart with their money than not wanting to spend money. But, point number 2 kind of bounces off of that as well. It is a business. I would be willing to guess that Steve Cohen and John Middleton of the Phillies are probably the only 2 owners who have actually like operated in a way where they say we're okay with being in the red.
Mm-hmm.
I think just about every other owner, even the ones of the teams like the Dodgers that get praised for spending, like the Dodgers make so much money that the Dodgers are probably still in the green with the amount they spend. And if they actually were in a spot where they were about to go into the red, they wouldn't do it. Because it is almost always going to be about, even if you really do want your team to win the World Series and you do put a lot of effort into that, you're still going to want to make money. They're 2 goals that you have from owning a baseball team, most likely. Even if you want to win, you're going to want to make money too, because that's smart business. And I think a lot of owners are going to try to find a way to do both. The other note is there are different tiers of owners. Like Mark Attanasio is not doing the same stuff that John Fisher was doing, or he's not doing the same kind of stuff that Bob Nutting's doing, where you haven't signed anybody to a multi-year deal in free agency in like 10 years. Not 10 yet, but we're getting close to it because I think Nova in 2016 was the last time they did it. Like, there are different tiers of owners.
Yeah.
And then I guess the final point is like the stuff that I had said when Wagner was on here a few minutes ago. I believe it. Like I do think Mark is a lot more transparent than other owners are.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know in Boston, God, I can't remember the name of the guy who owns the Red Sox, but he didn't talk to the media for like a year. And there was a big uproar over it about how, like, why can nobody get it? Why can nobody talk to the owner? What's going on here? You don't have that same kind of issue with Mark. He does make himself a lot more available than a lot of other owners do. But like everything we talked about is also true. I think he shoots himself in the foot a lot because he'll say things that he shouldn't be saying, like whether it's he's trying to make a point and it comes out wrong and it actually ends up being interpreted as something completely different, which again, I'm sorry, that comes with the territory of owning a baseball team and speaking for the baseball team. Like you're going to be heavily scrutinized like that. But generally speaking, I think for the way he makes himself accessible to the media, the percentage of reported revenue that the Brewers spend on payroll in their market size, and then also the resources they put into player development, the way that Mark usually seems pretty content now with like letting his front office do its thing and not butting in.
Yep.
I don't think I'd say he's like an amazing owner or anything, but like he's just almost everything about him seems perfectly inoffensive to me.
In terms of transparency, I think even just the fact that he sits in the seats is not super common. Like the willingness to just be within, he's by the fans. He's sitting there out there in the open. He does talk to the media a lot. He'll do TV interviews. Sometimes he'll do them from the seats. I do think that's something that should be, we don't need to applaud him and, give him a standing ovation for doing that. But I think it should be recognized that it is a little bit different than what most of the organizations are getting from ownership. He's not really afraid to go out there and answer some tough questions that are asked of him at times too. So I agree. I think there's some maybe stumbling over words or just not phrasing things super well where it makes him sound worse than he's meaning to, or make things sound worse than they're meant to. And we saw it right here, especially if something is taken a little bit out of context, it sounds way worse. So I think all of those, I agree with that. I think I was going to touch on the same point you made where there are just not very many owners. And honestly, I was only thinking Cohen. I think you're right on Middleton. But I think we're probably talking about two owners who are legitimately willing to take a loss in their pursuit of a World Series. And that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more of them. But in reality, we're comparing him to his peers right now. We're not comparing him to the ideal owner in our imaginary worlds. Like, that's not how it works. He's got to be compared to the other people who are in his shoes and the people who would potentially be in his shoes if they bought the team. I won't even go too far into everything you said. I agree that, like, I don't think he's grade A, the top of the line owner, because for that reason, I think there are owners that we've seen who are willing to go that extra mile, and he's not. And that doesn't make him bad. It just means he's not in that top tier. But I have long said, I think I've tweeted it before, I don't know if I've said it on here before, but I think there's a much higher likelihood of the Brewers ownership being in a worse spot if Mark Attanasio was to sell to somebody else than to be in a better spot. I think it's much more likely things would be worse if he were to sell. The other point I want to make on that, I don't know exact numbers, but I believe Mark owns about 40% of the Brewers, if I am remembering correctly from the numbers that had come out at one point. He's the majority owner. There's a bunch of minority owners who own, the rest of it, about the 60%. But that also means he's making the final decision, but he has a lot of people who are relying on him to spend their money in a way that makes sense, and a lot of people who are hoping to make money off of this venture. It's not just Mark Attanasio's money that is poured into this franchise. There are a lot of people who are involved with this. I don't think that can be completely overlooked because he's responsible for those people. Those people are going to be up in arms if the Brewers start operating in a negative and they're just losing money hand over fist because Mark Attanasio said, screw it, I'm going for the World Series all in. We're doing what the Padres did a couple of years ago. I'm signing Xander Bogaerts to a terrible contract just to try and win this year. If he did that, there would be a lot of people who would be upset with him internally that he would have to deal with too. So it's not as simple as I think a lot of people like to make it. That's my main overarching point here. I think there's a lot of nuance, and a lot of nuance that we aren't even aware of as fans and people who are not actually in the building or in his suite or talking on the phone with him and his people. There's a lot of things nobody's aware of. So we give our best idea of what we think is happening. And I understand that plenty of fans are not big fans of Mark. You're entitled to that opinion. I just think sometimes it's not based as much in logic as it is in just wanting to be angry about stuff, especially in the off season. I think everyone falls into that trap with certain things, but that's the one thing. And then I do just want to quickly, I feel like this needs to be clarified because I am seeing it way too often in regard to payroll. Stop using the end of season number, which was about 114 million for the Brewers, and comparing it to the opening day number. They are different numbers.
Yeah.
During the season, you have waiver claims, trades, free agent signings. You have call-ups that you have to account for. You have 60-day IL guys who you're still paying while you call up other people. The end of season number, unless you rebuild at the deadline, is almost always going to be higher than the opening day payroll. The Brewers are currently around 110 million for 2025. They started last year at 104.3 million. I think a lot of people are looking at Spotrac or Spotrac. I can never remember how you pronounce it. They are not including all of the pre-ARB eligible players in their 99 million that they're saying the Brewers are basically at a $99 million payroll. They're not including all of the minimum guys who are going to be on the roster. Once you add those, they're basically at 110 million, which is about 6 million higher. Mark had said they're about 5 million higher than last year. That's not something to applaud necessarily. I'm not saying we need to give them a bunch of credit for raising the payroll by $5 million. That's not my point. My point is it's annoying me a bit that we're having good reporters like a Ken Rosenthal, like a Robert Murray, who made a video about how the Brewers have gone down in payroll every year and caused a bit of an uproar himself. It's not actually true. Like you can make the point that they're not raising it enough, whatever, but I get annoyed when we're just going completely out of the way of facts. Like they have not lowered the payroll. The payroll is higher this year on opening day than it was last year. That's a fact. That is the actual fact of the matter. It is not lower. And by the end of the season, I would bet, unless things fall apart and they have to sell at the deadline or something, I would bet it's going to be higher than the 114 million that they ended last season at as well, because that's almost impossible not to clear that with all of the moves that they're going to have to make over the course of a season. So again, this isn't me defending Mark's honor or doing anything like that, but it's just bothering me how many people are like, we're not looking at it factually. We're just taking numbers and like throwing them out there, and it's getting people more upset, and it's not the truth. So that's bothering me. It's been bothering me. Just wanted to lay it out how I actually view the payroll, because that's, to me, how you have to compare. You can compare end of season to end of season or opening day to opening day, but you cannot compare the two because it's apples to oranges. They are not the same thing.
I think there's a subset of people out there too who, whenever you try to make that kind of nuance or that kind of distinction, they'll just accuse you of you're defending a billionaire.
Yep.
It's not really relevant to me. Like, but let's just try to get everything right if we can. Like, who cares how much money they make? Who cares if they own the team? Who cares if they're doing a good job or a bad job of owning the team and reinvesting in the team? Let's just try to get things right.
Yes.
Let's try to get things right. Let's as a fan, I think you should hope to have an organization that is well run, that is responsible with its resources. I think all of that stuff should hold true no matter who your owner is, how much your team is spending, where they're at in their competitive cycle, like whatever's going on. I guess that's like the overarching theme to end on. We'll move on now to some listener questions here that we did not cover early in the podcast. We have a couple left over that we're going to get to really quickly here and knock them out, and then we'll do your minor league sandbox, and we'll get out of here. We'll start with a question, ironically, still relating to the front office. So this question that we got on Twitter, David Stearns was obviously a special case with him being a Mets fan growing up. But do you get the sense that Matt Arnold could be poached by a big market team? Ken Rosenthal's article talking about cost cutting makes me think at some point he might leave as well. I think if you're the Brewers, you need to be prepared for everyone to leave at some point. So yeah, I would not be shocked at all if Matt Arnold within the next few years is the head executive somewhere else. I don't know how many years he has left on his contract, but I'd be willing to guess it's not many at this point. I can't remember if it was ever reported if he did sign an extension when he was technically not. I don't think he ever got like a full promotion, but I know he became the head executive when David Stearns left. But I'm assuming he probably got some kind of deal around the time that happened. So who knows if he's on the same one right now or where that's at. I don't know. But I would imagine whatever contract he's under, it's probably going to expire within the next couple of years. And if the Brewers continue having this kind of success, he's absolutely going to be in demand from bigger market teams with more resources. And he has every right to pursue those opportunities. So I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up somewhere else in a couple of years. It also just doesn't concern me that much because the Brewers have proven multiple times now that they're always prepared for this kind of thing. They have guys in the organization who they're always grooming to be the next man up. Matt Arnold was the guy who they groomed to be the next man up after David Stearns left. So, I'd have to take another look at their front office structure right now, but I know like Matt Klein is a guy who has some pretty good involvement behind Matt Arnold right now as one of the top executives. The rest of them are kind of slipping off the top of my head right now. But those are the kinds of guys you're probably looking at who would be that internal promotion when he leaves. But I don't know if it's necessarily like Arnold would leave because he's upset about the cost cutting. Actually, from what I've gathered, I think that Matt Arnold himself is like someone who adheres to this philosophy of like, even if we have the resources, let's not just waste them or like use them irresponsibly. So I think there are instances where what gets attributed to Attanasio's cheapness is actually Matt Arnold showing some restraint and not being fully on board with this being the best way to use resources. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. So even if he goes somewhere else, yes, he would obviously spend more. I think Stearns is kind of a good model where like, yes, we've seen him sign some marquee free agents, that he could have never signed with Milwaukee, but like, you also haven't seen him like pay top dollar for guys with very clearly flawed profiles like, the Padres do sometimes. Like that hasn't been happening there. He's not operating like AJ Preller, signing Xander Bogaerts to a 12-year deal when he's probably not going to stick at shortstop for more than 2 seasons. So I think it's kind of a similar situation here. Yes, I'm sure he's going to end up somewhere else. Is it going to be totally in response to cost cutting on the Brewers' part? I don't think so. I think it's going to be, there's just a new opportunity for him somewhere else. And yes, there are going to be more resources there, but that doesn't mean he's looking at it strictly like I now have more room to spend irresponsibly, I guess. Because I do think the way he likes to operate already kind of fits naturally pretty well with the constraints the Brewers have. So that's my take on it. Spencer, I don't know what you have to say in response to that.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think the Brewers as a whole, as an organization, pretty much have to be prepared for people to leave. Just to compare it to Stearns, I think Arnold's favorite team growing up was the Dodgers, if I remember correctly. So I don't think that job's opening up anytime soon unless we see some retirement in the future there. But I think he's somebody who is going to be in high demand. He was already, if people remember, the Mets looked at him before Stearns when I believe they ended up hiring Van Wagenen. Is that his name? I can't remember.
Yeah,
Rody Van Wagenen, I think.
That was a bad hire.
Yes, it was a bad hire. Matt Arnold would have been much better than that. But like he's already had demand going back to even prior to being the head man, and now he's showed some very good things in his time in that role. So he's going to be in demand at some point. Who knows what the Brewers will do in terms of, paying up to keep him if they really, really want him. I have no idea. I mean, we don't know, but I think just the general idea of like being prepared for it is definitely something the organization will be. I want to say the other like higher up is Matt Klentak, which means that they're all Matts. Everybody's named Matt at the top of the organization. So keep that in mind. If your name is Matt out there, you might be in line when Matt Arnold moves on to move into one of the higher up positions in the Brewers front office. But yeah, I think they would have internal candidates and
a hierarchy of Matts, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. They, the whole thing, we just built the whole front office out of Matts, and that's all we're going to go with.
Next question we have comes from Bill, who asks, who's a dark horse to make the opening day roster? And then as a follow-up, he also asks us to make a bold prediction for somebody in the Brewers bullpen. Spencer, do you have any dark horses to make the opening day roster? Guess it always depends on how you define dark horse.
Right. That's kind of my thing. I don't know if he should count as a dark horse here because he was on the roster to end the season, but including this podcast, I feel like nobody talks about Isaac Collins this whole offseason. And I actually think he like does some pretty good things. His AAA, like he hit the ball hard in AAA. He's a switch hitter. He can play infield and outfield spots. He's pretty fast. Like he's the type of guy who I think I could see Oliver Dunn starting in AAA with him, filling more of the, utility type role while Durbin gets most of the starts or whatever to start the year. Like, that would not surprise me at all. I think the true dark horse is probably Ernesto Martinez Jr. And I think that probably comes down to a potential injury. I think probably has to happen for that. But I do think if Rhys Hoskins were to get injured, that he would have a decent chance. And if especially like Tyler Black or Jake Bauers were hurt, I think he's going to get a very real look in spring training, I think. And Todd Rosiak posted some fun BP video of him the other day. And I mean, those are the swings he takes in games, and he still doesn't whiff. Like, he had a 90th percentile whiff rate last year. So it's pretty impressive, the amount of contact he makes with just absolutely huge. Like, we're talking probably as big a swing as you've seen since Prince Fielder, and he somehow doesn't whiff a ton, at least in Double-A. So I think that's maybe the one that's the most off the radar. But like I said, I just feel like no one's talked about Isaac Collins all offseason, and I actually think there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, so are you defining dark horse as somebody who has not gotten a lot of public attention who you think is going to make it, or is it somebody who, like, even the Brewers are probably not counting on making the roster, who could end up making it? If it's the latter, I do think it's Martinez. But if it's the former, I'm going to say Vinny Capra. Nobody ever talks about Vinny Capra, but Vinny Capra is still on the 40-man roster. He is out of options. You can't send him back down. I think there's a very real scenario, especially if the Brewers don't make any more acquisitions. I think if they acquire someone, he could be on the chopping block. But he's versatile. He's got good plate discipline, good swing decisions. Like, I do think there's a reason why the Brewers have kept this guy around this long, because, like, it was almost kind of miraculous how long he lasted on the 40-man roster throughout all of last season with all of the turnover that we had last year. And he's still around. Out of options. I do think there is a world where, like, Andre Monasterio is not making the team. They use his option to send him back down, and Vinny Capra's on the roster as kind of your jack of all trades utility guy. He's also a good defender, like a good defender at shortstop even. I think people kind of overlook him because he's a small guy. He's never gonna hit for power or anything like that. But in the minor leagues, he's been a pretty good contact guy, draws a ton of walks in the minor leagues, plays good defense all around the field. Out of options. Like, I think he's going to be on that opening day roster as the utility guy, but I haven't seen like a single person even bring up his name. I might be the only person who's ever written a Vinny Capra story. I did a Vinny Capra story at spring training last year. Maybe someone else did, and I'm giving myself too much credit, but he's a guy who's not talked about a lot, who I think will be on that roster. And then as far as bold prediction for someone in the bullpen, I think Grant Anderson's going to be one of their best relievers when all is said and done.
Come on, you stole mine.
Was that yours?
Yeah, I had a secondary.
Otherwise, I can rescind that one, and I can talk about Nick Mears. I think Nick Mears.
It's okay.
Pretty good too.
You can take Grant Anderson if you want.
Okay.
I'm going to pick another guy who throws weird, so we'll both do that. Mine is more. I don't know if it's even a bold prediction in terms of like statistically blowing people completely out of the water. But I think my bold prediction is that Ryan Middendorf throws like 25 to 30 innings in the big leagues this year. And just out of nowhere, nobody's really looking at him. Nobody's expecting it. Kind
of like your Jared Koenig of, Koenig threw like 60 innings, but like kind of similar, like kind of circumstances that could get him on the 40-man and into the big leagues. Yeah. And Middendorf, I mean, this is, speaking of Anderson's, sidearm delivery, it's a similar type of delivery for Middendorf. He was up to 98.7, I believe, last year, a couple of times in a few games in AAA with his fastball. But he sits more in like that 95, 96 range with a four seam that has a good vertical approach angle when he gets it up. And he throws a bunch of pitches. It's 5 distinct pitches. He does drop the arm a bit on a couple of the off-speed pitches, and I think that hurt him in AAA. I think this is probably dependent on being able to throw all of his pitches from at least closer to the same arm angle. But even if he doesn't, they may just drop the pitches that because he throws 5, they could probably get away with, like, the curveball is one of them, but he also throws a slider. You could probably get away with shortening up the repertoire a little bit. But a guy who throws from a funky arm angle with a
pretty big velo as well and a bunch of pitches. Walks were not horrific in AAA. They weren't great, but they were okay. They were probably higher than you'd want. But I think that was partially because he wasn't getting the chase on the pitches that he had gotten at lower levels, probably because the upper levels had figured out, okay, we can lay off this pitch, or we can tell this is a curveball basically just from the release point. So I think that played a role. But I've always liked him, and I actually had started to kind of push him aside because of the numbers at AAA. But then when I dug into him a little bit more a few days ago, I actually thought, okay, I think there's some things that if they clean it up, there actually is something here. So he's my random like Peter Strzelecki, Jake Cousins out of nowhere type of guy who, like, he's also an indie ball guy, I should note. So yeah, that's my pick
now.
Yep.
I guess with that, we can transition into your minor league sandbox to wrap up this week. As we start, though, I can kind of give you this question to tee it up first, kind of bouncing off talking about Ernesto Martinez as a dark horse to make the roster. Nate K asked, how excited can we be about Ernesto? So I'll let you start off the minor league sandbox with that question. Take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think we can be pretty excited about Ernesto. I think this is a guy who, I had somebody point this out to me the other day, but he is 26, but due to injuries and COVID, he's actually followed a pretty normal timeline in terms of like how many plate appearances he's had at each level. He's now maxed out. He's had the most at AA, but he just broke 600 plate appearances there. So for the most part, he's actually been on a relatively normal path. It's just he missed the whole season for COVID after missing an entire season because of a torn ACL. He dealt with a bunch of injuries the year after COVID, and everything just got pushed back a little bit. But this is one of the most athletic dudes you will see play first base. Like I've said before, he spent time in center field at a couple different levels. He even filled in center field for the Shuckers a couple of times last year. If you find any video on Twitter, you can find video of him just doing the splits, going after, balls thrown to him at first base. This is a 6'5", 250-pound man who can do the splits with relative ease, I would say. And he's a lot of fun to watch. He's kind of an electric player. He stole over 20 bases last year. And I mentioned the swing. It is a huge, huge swing, but it's somehow relatively under control. And he hit the ball 90th percentile exit velocity last year, would have been in the top 10 in MLB at over 109 miles per hour. So just there's a lot to like. I think the age does matter here, but I also think he's kind of like the prototypical late breakout. So I think you should be reasonably excited about him. And like I said, I do think there's a chance he's that dark horse. And at the same time, I think there's a very good chance that we end up seeing him at some point this season. We have two other questions for the sandbox as well. So Tyler asked us, so many third base prospects shooting up the national lists. He lists Eric Batanti, Brock Wilken, Mike Bovee, Luke Adams, and more. He asks, I know these problems tend to work themselves out and they're mixed through a number of levels, but do you see the Brewers asking any of these guys to expand their positional versatility this year? So I'll start with saying most of these guys have all of these guys have played first and third since coming into the organization. I think we've seen a little bit of Bovee at second, but he didn't play it at all this year. I think they're probably not super high on that likelihood. I think of all of these, Luke Adams potentially moving into a corner outfield spot has always been something I thought was possible. He's a very, very good athlete for his size, and he has a good, strong arm, so he could play right field. I've always thought that was a possibility for him, so I think maybe of that group, that's the one I could see potentially moving a little bit. The Ginger asks, what would Mike Bovee have to do to get the call this year, and how likely is that to happen? So, I mean, for me, he's got to mash. He's got to show that he can stay healthy over the course of a season, because that has been a struggle for him in that first year and a half in pro ball. And then I think he needs to show he can at least handle third base defensively. It doesn't need to be great. if he's mashing, I should say, if he is hitting as well as I think he can, I think he needs to at least show he can handle it, and maybe even more than just like in a pinch, but actually like, okay, I could start Mike Bovee at third base today and feel fine with it. I think that's basically where Andrew Monasterio has been defensively, and I think he's capable of being that level of a defender at third, maybe even a little better. How likely is that? I guess I would just say my odds of him playing in MLB this year are probably around 40% or so. I think it's not quite 50-50, but I think there's a decent chance of it happening. So that will be the 3 questions we had. I've got a couple other updates I'll go through quickly here. I know I promised some longer ones coming up, but I'm going to need more from the beat writers down in Arizona giving me more information. Jack, I'm going to be relying on you later on. But well, when Kurt gets down there too, I'll get some more minor league info, I'm sure. But hasn't been a ton that came out. We did get some bad news, unfortunately, with Josh Noth. He had Tommy John surgery over the winter. He will miss all of 2025. One of the young pitchers who was drafted 2 drafts ago. He only just turned 19 at the end of the season. So in terms of development timeline, he's got plenty of time to figure things out. I think the thing we have to watch as Brewers fans is he will now have 1 less year to kind of prove himself before Rule 5 eligibility, which is after the 2027 season. So he'll have 2 more seasons after this instead of 3. And when you're talking about what will still be a young guy with good stuff, that can kind of be a tough one to make a decision on for the organization, even if the results are great, he'll, obviously pull the trigger for him in terms of adding him to the 40-man. But if the results are middling or, you see flashes, then it becomes a tougher decision when you just have less of a sample size. And it also is a bit of a developmental stunt for him here because he will have to take a full year off from being in games and working specifically on certain things with the organization that they wanted him to work on. So in terms of his long-term outlook, I don't worry much about Tommy John surgery at this point, but in terms of the Brewers' outlook on it, I think you have to view it as a bit of a hit for how they're going to have to make their decision in a couple of years. But the final thing I'll talk about here is just a couple I talked about. I'm going to try and hit on a couple underrated players. I'm mostly going to stick with pitchers for now, but we'll do 2 underrated arms. So Jason Woodward, another guy from the same draft class as Noth, who ironically had, I don't know if ironically is the right word. Yeah, it's ironic, I think. He had Tommy John surgery at draft time. He missed all of his draft year and then most of last season, came back at the end of it. And I mean, he looked good. I watched him pitch a couple times for Carolina. The velocity, which was said to be, touching 95 or so in college, was more touching 97, sitting 95, 96. It was seen as a plus changeup coming out of college. I saw nothing to dispute that. It looked very, very good. I think what surprised me were the 2 breaking balls. He was throwing a slider and a curveball, and I thought both very different planes, and I thought both were very sharp and pretty late breaking. Everything he threw just kind of popped, and he's not on any lists right now. He seems like a guy for me who could maybe have that Logan Henderson type of ascension where he just flies up lists, even though he really wasn't seen on many of them coming into the season. And then the other one is from last year's class, Jaron DeBerry, $25,000 signing out of Dallas Baptist. This was one that I actually had on my personal favorites list heading into the draft that I had tweeted out. So I was very happy that they ended up taking him. This is a legitimate 6-pitch mix. So Brewers love their kitchen sink guys. Very, very skinny dude. Didn't walk hardly anybody, threw a ton of strikes in college. He's got a 4-seam, he's got a cutter, he's got a sinker. It's probably more of an actual 2-seam. It's kind of a running fastball. It's not, I would say of all his pitches, the 2-seam is the worst currently. And then he has a very, very good sweeper plus pitch, which is a big time out pitch for him and was in college. And then he also throws a curveball with a lot more depth to it and not much sweep. It's more 12-60. So, and then of course he also has a changeup, which I would say is probably second second worst pitch behind the or above the two seam, but really good command. I think they're, like I said, he's super skinny. I think he's somebody who could add a little bit of mass, and all of a sudden you see the velo tick into those mid 90s instead of low 90s. With every fastball in his repertoire, with 2 breaking balls and a changeup, it just feels like a guy who's going to have a lot of success in the Brewers organization with their pitching instruction and how they operate. So I'm really excited to see him this year. He didn't end up pitching in any full season ball games. I believe he got assigned to Carolina, but he did not get into any games for them. So very excited to watch those two this year. That's 4 arms now. I'll try and get a bat in there next week if I can, but a lot of the underrated arms I feel like are the ones, or underrated players end up being pitchers a lot of times, because a lot of times those are the ones with the good stuff that maybe had limited numbers or not great numbers on the surface, but you can kind of see the stuff and some of the command coming along. So that'll wrap up my minor league sandbox for this week. But like I said, once we get some more info down in Arizona, we might have a little bit more to talk about. I'm sure, again, I'm still always probably going longer than Jack wants anyway, but we give the people what they want, Jack, and the people want the sandbox.
It is what they want, and they get it every week now because we're back on the weekly format. That'll do it for us this week. That's a lot of time saying the word week in a couple sentences there. I don't feel very good about that. But by the time you're listening to this, the Brewers might already be playing spring training baseball. Games starting up this weekend already, so baseball's getting ever closer. Should have some more storylines coming up in the following weeks of camp. Until then, thank y'all for tuning in. This is the Brewer Fanatic Podcast.